All right, we are going to do something now on the program since it's a holiday weekend. And we get to do what we want on the holidays. We've been trying to start this for some time, and there's always something coming up or some other big show or somebody doing something stupid. But we got an email a while back from Jason, from New Albany, Indiana, by the way, right across the river here. But it's why they call it Kentuckiana. A little bit of Kentucky, a little bit of Indiana. But anyway, he mentioned that he had done some searches on YouTube. He couldn't find too many conversations that I've had on championship wrestling from Florida, otherwise than talking about Kevin Sullivan, Eddie Graham. And he was just wondering what your first experience with the territory was, Florida, and what you thought of it in the 70s and early 80s. Obviously, you've explained why you went to Mid-South from Memphis instead of other territories. But if the opportunity to go to Crockett in 1985 didn't happen, do you think you and the Midnight would have been successful in Florida or anywhere else for that matter? And that got us to start thinking, well, what if we had gone, you and me being us, what if we had gone somewhere else in January of 1985? And for longtime listeners of the program, the Midnight Express and I had been in Mid-South Wrestling working for Bill Watts from November of 83 to December of 84. And when we were told we were finishing up, we had already had a standing offer from both Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes to come to the Carolinas and work for Jim Crockett. So that's obviously where we wanted to go. And I called and made the arrangements to get a start date because we hadn't been told anything by Watts or Bill Dundee or anybody, just you're finishing on December 15th or whatever it was. So we had that waiting on us, so we took it. Well, then we heard from Dundee that Watts wanted us to go to Dallas, that they were making arrangements to book us over there for World Class, the Von Erichs, because Watts and Fritz were going to start a talent sharing agreement. Fritz already had TV and with that World Class syndication in a number of Watts's markets, especially up in Oklahoma. And so that way Watts could bring us back to Mid-South shows like the Superdome or the Oklahoma City and Tulsa shows or something big, whatever, Houston. And that was the idea behind that.
And Fritz owned a piece of some of the Oklahoma towns.
I was about to say, and he did at that point have points in Tulsa and Oak City. They didn't really Watts didn't run any spot shows in Oklahoma. He just had the two big towns, and my God, they were gold mines. I've told a story we did, $160,000 in one day in between Tulsa and Oak City for the last Stampede, and they were just huge houses. But he didn't run any spot shows, and Oklahoma was closer to Texas, so Fritz went into especially southern Oklahoma with a lot of his spot shows. But anyway, so the point was now we're beholden to Watts for giving us our break and putting us in a spot where we could go anywhere we wanted to. So we said, all right, so we called Crockett back and explained the situation that Watts wanted us to go to Dallas so that he could still have some dates and et cetera. And of course, that's when one of the first things that Jimmy Crockett ever said to me, and I thought I'd started a promotional war. When I told him that, he said, well, that's okay. It's not the first time Bill Watts has screwed me. I'm like, oh, shit, what am I starting here? God damn it. I don't want to be in this position. But so that's what
wouldn't
happened.
Be the last time either.
Well, exactly. So that's why we went to Dallas, and we spent 6 months there. And I mentioned it was a great rest after Mid-South. We only worked 5 days a week usually. All Monday in Fort Worth and Friday in Dallas, so we were home 2 nights a week. In town where we lived 2 nights a week. A lot of the spot shows were close. Of course, there was the South Texas business, which didn't draw and you couldn't make any money. And every once in a while, you'd fly Southwest out to West Texas, which you really didn't make any money out there at that point in time, but at least it was cheap to get there. But we put our time in there until we realized that we weren't going to go very much further. And we'd been working with the Fantastics for 6 months, which we loved it. But, you needed to work with Von Erichs to make money. So we we got our payoff for Texas Stadium and we gave our notice and we ended up going to Crockett. But that was in the 1st of July of 1985. If we'd have backed up, and in January 1985, we had no plans. We thought we'd take a look at what the options were and tell people a little bit about not only whether we would have gone there, but why, what kind of money there was to be made in the different territories, what the living arrangements were, or the travel, or what fit and why. And as we sat down, Brian and I ran this by you, and you added a couple of things. Because Jason in his email also said that I guess in 1985, your choices were limited as where you could go. Well, these were the territories still operating in 1985. Championship Wrestling from Florida. Georgia Championship Wrestling was operating, but it had been kneecapped and handicapped because in 1984, when Vince bought out the existing company by getting the Briscoes shares and a couple other people and left Ole out in the cold, Ole had gone, the TBS got a bunch of letters, complaints from people wanting to see their, as they termed it, Gordon Soley wrestling, and instead they got the WWF, and they were pissed. And so Turner gave Ole a early morning Saturday time slot for championship. What was he calling it? Championship Wrestling from Georgia at that point?
That's right. Correct.
Yeah. So Ole had TV and he was running towns, but it wasn't setting the world on fire. You also had Continental Championship Wrestling in Alabama. You also had the Memphis territory. You had Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas and Virginia. You had Mid-South Wrestling in Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. You had World Class in Dallas, and as we mentioned, all over the state of Texas and part of Oklahoma, and they were starting to branch out and run some out of the territory towns based on their TV syndication, which usually did well the first time and then died after that, like Boston. You had San Antonio, which in 1985, goddamn, it was limping along, but there was still a territory. I remember watching the TV. That's where Fred Ottman was Big Bubba, Typhoon. Dusty loved Big Bubba's because Ottman became his son-in-law. So San Antonio was territory. Obviously, the AWA, Vern Gagne, was not only still a territory, but now one of the geographically largest in the country, and they were just starting the downhill slide at that point after 83 with Hulkamania and the hot business they were doing. You had Kansas City, a.k.a. the Central States. You had Calgary, maybe. Was that a point? Was that after the Vince bought Calgary in 1984 and then within a year reneged on it and they started running again? So you kind of, and then Calgary ran 86, 87, 88. You had a territory there in that time frame.
Right. And Calgary had shut down. And then the excuse Vince used to get out of that deal with Stu was Bruce Hart had started running again as Stampede. And that was, where things went from there.
Yes. And so he said, since Bruce Hart ran spot shows in front of 500 people calling it Stampede Wrestling, the whole deal's off, and I'm going to keep that $900,000 I was going to give you over the next 9 years. We also had Portland. Obviously, the WWF. Puerto Rico was running at that time. It was past the glory days. It was after. No, it was not past the glory days because Brody wasn't killed until 88. You also had Montreal, which they were running that was 85 was the time of the Rougeaus and the Garvins angle that did huge business in Montreal at up to 15,000 people, right?
Correct.
You also had, you mentioned Mario Savoldi's ICW, although that wasn't really a territory as much as an early independent where they flew top guys in and used locals and ran different towns. They had TV, but I don't know if it ever made broadcast affiliates or if it was just like sports cable or whatever.
It was on Sports Channel, but I think it's important to note that after the WWF's national push, after they took TV out of Allentown and Hamburg and went to White Plains and started doing stuff out of Canada, for a lot of the areas that were used to regular local WWF house shows,
right,
they started getting what would become the NWF with DC Drake or what would become Savaldi's ICW.
Who would use the former WWF names in top matches and then use the locals underneath, and it was kind of like the old-fashioned WWF spot shows. Also, was anything going on in Nova Scotia or the Maritimes? Where was Al Zink? Where was Dupree?
There was definitely stuff going on. You definitely wouldn't have been going there.
We wouldn't have been going. They ran seasonally. And then also, and we know there was wrestling in Japan and Germany and England. And said we're talking North America and Mexico. The Midnight Express and Jim Cornette were not going to go to Mexico. We were not going to go to Germany. The boys might have gone to Japan at some point. It didn't come up because we were too busy. I would not have made that trip. But nevertheless, those were. So again, golly, that's all the options there were in 1985. Just those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, just those 16 territories we mentioned. So things were thinning out. And before we start talking about where we would have gone at that time, I think we've also got to acknowledge the territories that had been lost in the previous 3 to 5 years. That I think that's a place to start. These territories had just gone under. And would we or would we not, if they were still around, have wanted to work there? And the reasons for these territories going under are different, but with the exception of one, kind of similar, with the exception of two, kind of similar. Bruiser's WWA in Indiana had, they may have still been running a show or two in 1985, but it was over. The Sheik, because we got Bruiser, Indiana, the Sheik in Michigan and Ohio. It had gone, 81-ish?
Yeah, 80.
Yeah. Mike LaBelle in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles territory, the first territory to start closed-circuit television. They were so hot that the Olympic was selling out, and they were closed-circuiting the cards to movie theaters. Second biggest city in the country. It didn't go under due to Vince's national expansion. It was already limping along, and LaBelle took an out and agreed to go to work with Vince and was the local promoter out there for a little while. But the actual Los Angeles territory, including all the Southern California towns and San Jose and Modesto's Uptown Arena, one of the most famous places in the world, thanks to Larry Barnheiser, the photographer. And that whole territory had basically it had aged out. Mike LaBelle and Rock Rims's tremendous Southern California histories go into great detail on this, or history, as well as the NorCal history. Mike LaBelle was never a guy that was in love with the wrestling business. His mother, Eileen Eaton, and her husband, Cal, were the boxing and wrestling promoters. They had the lease on the Olympic Auditorium, and they did the TV out of there. But it wasn't like, I love the wrestling business and I'm going to go down fighting. When things started going south, he wasn't going to put any money into it. And finally the talent drifted away and you couldn't make money there, and it just aged out. Straight up north from Los Angeles. Go ahead.
With LA, there's a lot of different issues. Losing the TV and having to go to just Spanish language television was a big problem.
Yeah.
They lost their studio show. They lost Dick Lane. And then they lost a lot of prime talent. We can all go back now and romanticize about Piper and Chavo, but at the time, that was all there was. At one point, LA was just stacked and had such great talent. By the end of the 70s, especially after they lost Piper, there wasn't very much. And we talked about Stu before. Vince had a deal with Mike LaBelle where Mike LaBelle was going to be the partner on the West Coast for the WWF, because Mike LaBelle was the one who brought him in and ushered Vince around, him and Jeff Walton. And then Vince reneged on that deal, and there was a lawsuit, and Mike LaBelle got, I don't think, anything.
Well, he got to go home.
And produce porn.
Yeah, well, there you go. And then, as we said, Roy Shire in San Francisco, one of the not only all-time geniuses in the wrestling business, but also San Francisco and the Cow Palace, most of the 60s, was per capita one of the biggest drawing cities in the country for wrestling, especially in the early 60s when they opened up and Stevens first got hot. But same things happened with Roy Shire. He was an abrasive personality. He pissed off his TV station and lost his main TV. And he didn't have a good relationship with his local promoters in some of the spot show towns and the other Northern California towns and out into Nevada. And talent started leaving, and he finally, instead of running a territory, Shire had to just contract with existing promotions to try to fly in talent to just run the Cow Palace, and that was the beginning of the end. And so San Francisco, was that gone by 81, was it?
Well, 81
was it 80?
Yeah, it was pretty much done completely by 81, and then Vern moved in.
Yeah. And then also another long-standing territory that had been revolutionary in the business for so many years, Amarillo, under Dory Funk Sr. Dory Sr. had died in 1973. Terry and Dory inherited it, and they had, who was it? Dory's brother-in-law was the booker at one point, and they had family members and people to run the territory when they were on the road because they were the NWA champion and or two of the biggest stars in the business during that time. But finally, they saw the writing on the wall. Amarillo had never been a big money territory. There weren't big population centers. There weren't, major arenas, but they did good, steady, consistent business in the small buildings in the smaller cities for years and years and years. And Scott Teal just did an excellent Amarillo history book that goes back to the turn of the 20th century. And even though Amarillo was never a big money territory or a place where they did stadium shows or whatever, because Dory Funk Sr. was in charge, and also because of Dean Denton and Dory Denton before them, and the original Dutch Mantell and guys that went back to the 1920s, West Texas wrestling was big, and whoever was the top guy was the toughest man in the world. So Dory Funk Sr. had that reputation all those years. But finally, at the end of the 70s, the TBS show was started on cable, Georgia Championship Wrestling. Terry Funk has said that they saw writing on the wall that cable was going to change everything and little territories probably weren't going to make it. And they sold Amarillo to Dick Murdoch and Blackjack Mulligan. And they ran it for a couple of years. And Murdoch and Mulligan were two of the biggest names in the history of the wrestling business as wrestlers. I don't know. I knew Murdoch well. I met Mulligan a couple of times. I don't know that I would have considered either one of them businessmen when it came to actually running something and having discipline. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it didn't go.
And Mulligan struck out a couple times when he tried to be a promoter.
Yes, including, when I was running Knoxville, Flair said, "Hey, I bought that fucking 10 years ago, me and Mulligan. You owe me some money." I said, "Well, I'll give you a piece of the losses." And then lastly was Sam Muchnick in St. Louis. And St. Louis didn't go under. Sam Muchnick retired. And at the time, he was in his mid-70s. And he had been promoting St. Louis and made it the jewel of wrestling in the United States since 1945. So in 1982, January 1st, he retired and sold out the Checker Dome, the arena. They used to call it the Checker Dome when they had the Purina sponsorship. But Muchnick's last show in St. Louis drew 18,000 people because it was his retirement show, and the whole city came out and paid tribute. But that was the beginning of the end of St. Louis, because now after Sam retired, the remaining partners were Bob Geigel and Pat O'Connor and Harley had a bit of a piece, and Vern still had something of St. Louis, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
At that point.
Yes, he did.
But without Sam in charge, they started running it like they did Kansas City, and a lot more questionable finishes. St. Louis was the straightest place in the country for wrestling. And they started ha-haing it up a bit, and Larry Matysek quit in 83 because he could see that things were not headed well and tried to start opposition. But that's when Vince in 84 came in and bought the local TV time out from underneath him, and Larry had to end up doing a deal with Vince for a little while, which didn't last long, but the Kansas City office backed out of St. Louis because they were dying on the vine, and I think, what was it? It wasn't until 86 that Crockett started coming in trying to resurrect things, but it was...
Well, they still ran. They still ran all the way up until when Crockett came in, but it was
just nobody noticed.
It wasn't the same. They were bringing in guys from World Class. They were bringing in different guys, and Matysek, there was some promise when he started up because he had Brody.
Yeah.
He had King Kong Brody. They were friends. And he was the first guy. He brought Randy Savage in 83 to St. Louis, but I believe the show that was the big problem, I want to say the main event was Brody versus Mulligan, and then Mulligan no-showed. And it was after that, I want to say the network actually told Vince to get together with Larry Matysek because he had a relationship with him.
It was the TV station,
KPLR. Yeah.
Yeah. They said, hey, Larry's the local genius, and this is the big-time company from New York. Why don't you guys get together and we'll just make magic? And they didn't know how difficult it was for other promoters to work with Vince McMahon, wonder why.
And it's very different in the results and the people, but similar scenarios. You know, Ole Anderson thought he had it all figured out when he pushed Jim Barnett out. And he pushed Jim Barnett right into the arms of Vince McMahon when they needed him. They thought those Kansas City guys, Geigel and Harley, they thought they were going to be just fine. Bob Brown pushing out Larry Matysek. And again, different than Barnett, but he got pushed right into the arms of Vince McMahon right when he needed him, right when he was going to launch Wrestling at the Chase, right when he was going to come into St. Louis. Worked out perfectly. There's so many things that happened for Vince in the WWF in 83 and 84 that were just set up perfectly for him. He was in the right place at the right time to get the right people.
But those are the territories of note that had folded in the previous 5 years before 1985. Indiana under Bruiser, Detroit and Ohio, or Michigan and Ohio under the Sheik, Los Angeles, Mike LaBelle, San Francisco, Roy Shire, Amarillo, the Funks, and Amarillo had produced, just because of the pull that Dory Funk Sr. had, they had produced so many top name guys that went there for experience and seasoning, whatever, and the Japanese connection. You know, Baba would send whoever that he wanted to make something out of in the future. They'd go to work for the Funks. Everybody from Tenryu to Jumbo to fucking Onita. And then Sam Muchnick, you know, St. Louis. Hallelujah, St. Louis, the kingdom of wrestling. Those were all gone. Would we have gone there, Brian? You asked that question. Any of those places. And I got to start with Bruiser and Sheik because that's the most familiar wrestling that I grew up with besides Tennessee wrestling, because I could get the station from Bloomington, Indiana that showed Bruiser's show. That's the first one I saw. And if I went to visit Aunt Lola and Uncle Tommy in Cincinnati, by cracky, I would see the Sheik show. So I got to see a little bit of that, as well as that being geographically the closest places to my home besides the Tennessee territory. And the thing about Indiana was, it's hard to explain. The Indiana territory, Bruiser's WWA, was a kind of a territory in name only. In terms of the guys underneath on the card, they lived there in Indiana, and chances are a lot of them had real jobs and they moonlighted as wrestlers. Because look at a map of Indiana. It's fucking 240 miles from top to bottom, and side to side it's only about 160. So you can go anywhere in the state in a matter of a couple hours from Indianapolis, which is right in the middle. And then the top guys that worked for Bruiser, the main event guys, they would come in and out except for the period of the war with the Sheik between 71 and 74. Otherwise, Bruiser and Snyder, Wilbur Snyder, his partner, had started running Indiana in 1964 because that was Bruiser's home, and he had become one of the biggest stars in the business on the national TV and out of Chicago, and so had Wilbur Snyder. And they decided that they would take over the home territory. Because at the time, remember, Jim Barnett, from the late 50s on, was running the entire Midwest. He had Detroit and all of Michigan. He had Cincinnati and all of Ohio, except for Cleveland. He had all of Indiana. And Indianapolis was a huge Indianapolis was booming in the 50s. They were doing 10,000, 12,000 people at the fairgrounds for the shows. Cowboy Bob Ellis was huge at that time, etc. Indianapolis was probably, in the 50s, the best wrestling town of all of these. And Cincinnati was huge in the 50s and into the 60s. And the Sheik had gotten over there stronger than he did in Indiana, just like Bruiser got over in Indiana stronger than he did in Ohio, but they were still major stars. In Cincinnati, the Gardens would do 10,000 people. But by the time that Bruiser and Snyder started running Indianapolis in 64, that's when Barnett was making plans to go to Australia and open up the first World Championship Wrestling. And we've mentioned how that he made the offer, because Bruiser and Snyder, we found out through research, had already started running opposition. They were already going to run their own company in Indianapolis. So he made the offer to them like he made the offer to the Sheik in Detroit. He said, I'll sell Detroit and that territory to the Sheik, and I'll sell Indianapolis to Bruiser and Snyder, and I'll go to Australia. And as the story goes, Sheik paid him all the installments over however long until he was all paid off, even though Barnett was in Australia, and he never heard a goddamn word from Bruiser and Snyder again. But anyway, so Indianapolis was a small territory, and Bruiser was a very big whale in a small pond. He was one of the biggest stars in wrestling. Everybody in the state of Indiana considered him the toughest man walking the face of the earth. It was like having a local Texas territory where Steve Austin was the top star. And then he would have a rotating crew of people that would come in and work against him, but he was always the top guy, and Snyder was the secondary babyface, and usually in a tag team. And then, as I mentioned, you would bring in other guys. The reason why top stars would want to work Indianapolis is because, especially when the business was hot and you were working against Bruiser on top in Indianapolis, you got a great payoff. But not every town. And we've mentioned when I went to Fort Wayne for that minor league ball game appearance several years ago, the Fort Wayne Memorial Coliseum, the all-time record for people in that building remained Dick the Bruiser and Baron von Raschke from like 1972. They had a couple of big towns, you'd get big payoffs, but there was also a lot of spot shows. But that's the thing, Big Ernie Ladd didn't go to Lagooty. By the way, that is a real town. Sam Miniker would say every year when they did the county fairs, and we'll be in Lagooty at the county fair, 7:30 on Thursday night.
How do you spell that?
I don't know if it's an L-A or an L-O, but then it follows G-O-O-T-I-E, I believe.
Okay.
Lagooty. But anyway, they beefed the territory up from 71 to 74 because Bruiser was still smarting that the Sheik had Detroit, because Bruiser was big in Detroit too back in the day. And so he wanted to invade Michigan. And at that point, they started bringing in, and this unbelievably, I didn't know it at the time, but when I first started watching Indianapolis wrestling, they were in the middle of the hottest period they ever had as a company, and they were in the middle of a promotional war with the Sheik in Detroit. But I had no way of knowing this. I'm just watching the show, and I'm seeing 10,000 people packing the fucking building in Indianapolis watching Bobby Heenan take bumps, and Baron von Raschke and Cowboy Bob Ellis and Big Ernie Ladd and Blackjack Mulligan and Lanza and Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher. And I'm like, holy shit, this is great, right? Well, now with hindsight, when Bruiser opened up and started running Detroit, that was another major market he could draw talent and give them payoff out of. And even though Bruiser was losing the war, it made the Sheik's business hotter too. It was kind of like the promotional war, the Monday Night Wars, rising tide lifts all boats. Sheik goes on a run where in 72 and 73, he's having multiple sellouts in a row at the Cobo, which is 11, 12,000 people. Bruiser would run the Olympia Stadium in Detroit against those shows and draw 6,000, 7,000. So there'd be 20,000 people going to live wrestling in Detroit in the same night. So all of a sudden, you get the Blackjacks and Ernie Ladd, and then came the Valiant Brothers, and he had Bobby Heenan as a manager. And also because Bruiser had an ownership interest with Vern and everybody in Chicago, Bruiser's main guys could sometimes get on the card in Chicago, get another payoff of a major market. So from 71 to 74, while that was going on, there was money to be made for the main event guys working the Indiana territory, because the opportunity to go into Detroit, the opportunity to get booked in Chicago. The Indiana territory, even in the summer, when they would do the county fair shows, which were sold shows, the fair board would say, I'll give you $5,000. Bring me a wrestling show. Okay. They only ran 3 or 4 nights a week in the busy times. So that's what Blackie Guzman, who I never knew, Manuel Blackie Guzman.
Yeah.
Was one of the legendary names in all of Lucha Libre. He was partners and opponents with El Santo. He was a huge draw.
Paul Bosch loved him.
Paul Bosch loved him. Same guy in his 50s is living in Indiana for some reason and working preliminaries. Blackie Guzman, he did jobs on the prelims. But a lot of, and that's true with, for some reason, even Indianapolis had a high Hispanic population in those days, and they had a ton of Hispanic undercard guys. El Bracero, Jose Martinez, et cetera, et cetera. Also, I don't know that he ever really drew any money anywhere else, but Billy Red Cloud, for whatever reason, was so hot in the early 70s for Bruiser in Indiana and Michigan, a fucking American Indian, right? With the whole get-up that they made him the champion at one point. And Sailor Art Thomas, he was a huge baby face, a big, jacked-up bodybuilder. He was Art Thomas in the 50s. There were almost no bodybuilders in wrestling, and there were almost no black guys in wrestling. Well, here's a black bodybuilder. It looked as good as the Magnificent Zulu did 15 years later. So they loved him. But again, it was a territory where you kind of worked part-time, and if you were in the main events and you did other things, you could make good money, but just Chief Bobby Bold Eagle. Like I said, Ernie Ladd wouldn't go to Lagudi, but Bobby Bold Eagle, the kids loved him. He was Bob Boyer, an Italian that lived in Indiana, but he had the whole Indian outfit. So, bottom line, if this territory had still been around and was doing business like it was in the war of 71 to 74, it would have been a place for a manager and a tag team to go a la the Valiant Brothers and Bobby Heenan, because they were the classic bleach blonde tag team and he was the classic manager. And they had that run there in Indiana is what propelled them to go to New York and have the WWF tag team titles and go to San Francisco and go to Georgia, go to all the places Valiant Brothers went, because they not only did good business there, but they're working with, when Bruiser brought Bruno Sammartino in, when he was in between titles in New York, Bruiser and Bruno were a tag team. They worked a program with the Valiant Brothers. When Bruno won the WWF belt and had to go back to New York, they dropped the belts to the Valiant Brothers, And he went right back up to Vince Sr. and said, hey, great, classic, bleached blonde heel team. Looks like the Graham brothers. Bring them in.
Well, plus he liked John Sullivan, Johnny Valiant, because he was a local Pittsburgh guy.
Well, yeah, and Johnny was from Pittsburgh. But, I mean, Bruno's not going to say, this guy's my best friend. They're the shits. Bring them in and put the belts on them. He recommended them. But anyway, so you could work that territory. The trips were short. You could be home a lot. If you were main event guys, you could make money, especially in that period of time. The underneath guys, probably not so much. But that had been, that was 10 years beforehand. And I would have liked to have worked just because it's the next territory up from home. I grew up watching the TV. But honestly, even if Bruiser's territory had still been what it was 10 years previously, there were places to go. With us being hot off a good run and having contacts, there were places to go where we could have made a lot more money. So, and to be honest, also the reason why Bruiser's territory went out of business, it aged out. Bruiser was still on top. Snyder finally retired to Florida, but he would come back up for the Indianapolis show once a month or once every 3 weeks or whatever, and then he retired from that. And the only new guys, the young talent, Spike Huber, Bruiser's son-in-law, Steve Regal, Wilbur's son-in-law. Not saying they weren't talented, but they didn't go out and try to find new young guys to replace. I mean, for fuck's sake, Moose Cholak was driving a bus or a cab or something in Chicago and could still come to Indianapolis and be in a semifinal match. So it just got, when the promotional war ended, more of the top main talent dispersed because they didn't have as many payoffs as they were used to and not as sizable ones, and not changing the talent. And Sam Mineker had been the booker and the TV announcer since 1971. As they were going into 79, 80, 81, nothing had changed except the crowds, which had dropped. The same old guys were there, and they were 10 years older, the same TV. They didn't even do the TV in Indianapolis was the underneath matches of the Indianapolis house show that occurred every 3 weeks or so. So even the stars, like if Ox Baker was the champion, he'd go out and he'd beat the shit out of Prince Pullins in 6 minutes, and they'd show that on television. Then Ox Baker versus Bob Ellis for the world title would not be televised. But because also they only ran an Expo Center show or the fairgrounds in Indianapolis every 3 or 4 weeks, they wouldn't get enough shows to last till the next time. So they would rerun a show from 6 months before, or a year or 2 years before. If in the main event or in one of the matches, somebody on the next Expo Center card was featured in that show getting a good win, they'd fucking play that 2-year-old show again. I saw some matches between Cowboy Bob Ellis and Baron von Raschke, I guarantee you, 10, 12, 14 times. So it was just, I guess the classic way of wrapping it up, and we'll move on, is that my mother made the most perceptive statement to me that she had ever made in her life when she announced that she had seen a wrestling program on TV the night before, and it started this whole thing. I said, "Oh, can I watch next week?" She said, "Jimmy, this show looks just like the wrestling shows did when I first moved to Louisville in 1951. This was 1972, and she was right, except for color. It was not only shot the same way, in the same building, it featured the same names." So Indianapolis has a fond place in my heart. It's not a place that the Midnight Express would necessarily have gone as a choice. Although the trips are short, it's close to home. If you were on top, you could make some money, but nothing to write home about. It was all, and Bruiser and Snyder made a fortune because they owned the thing. And as I've mentioned, being a promoter was licensed to print money. Bruiser had a custom-made bed in his bedroom with a mattress 20 feet wide and had a home with the only urinal and a private bathroom in Indianapolis. Now,
well, maybe beyond Indianapolis, it might have been the whole state, because not too many people have urinals in their house.
Might have been the whole state. He wanted to feel at home. Any Indianapolis questions before we move to the Sheik in Detroit?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, actually.
This one, I had to go back and forth on, because even though Indianapolis was a magic town and Bruiser and Heenan and all this stuff, the Sheik's territory was much stronger. It was a place you could actually go most of the time it was in existence and work a regular schedule. And he had not only Detroit, but the rest of Michigan, Grand Rapids, Lansing. He had most of Ohio, including Cincinnati. And Cincinnati, through the late 50s into the 60s, even the early 70s, Cincinnati probably was second over that period of time only to Indianapolis in terms of drawing big crowds. Detroit peaked later on. Detroit peaked in the early 70s, as far as I can tell. They did big crowds in the 50s also under Barnett, but Sheik did the best of anybody in any of these spots with it in the 70s because he had that hot streak in the early 70s, along with the Toronto streak where he was selling 20-something thousand tickets a month in Detroit and the same amount in Toronto, and that went on for several years. So, and Columbus, Ohio, which was huge under Al Haft in the 50s and later on would get hot when Ole resurrected it in the early 80s off the TBS TV. They didn't set the world on fire, but during the Sheik's time, but they had a lot of show. Dayton, Ohio, Toledo, Ohio. So the Sheik had more towns, and Detroit was a fucking money machine in the 60s and 70s. And that's when the economy there was still good, and that's when the auto industry was not on its ass, and the Sheik got over and built that thing to where you could make money, especially if you were on top and being taken care of. And the Sheik was notorious for taking care of people he wanted to take care of and also not taking care of people he didn't want to take care of. But you could work full time. There were some long trips, but Detroit to Cincinnati ain't just a hop, skip, and a jump, but it's not anything like Mid-South or Calgary or those trips. So, and the Sheik always had a large variety of talent in his territory, and plus he had tremendous pull with the NWA because since as one of the biggest box office attractions in the business, he not only ran his own territory, but he worked out dates. He'd go to Los Angeles and work for LaBelle against Bobo Brazil or Freddie Blassie or whatever when he wanted to go shopping on Rodeo Drive and buy new suits. And he would go to Atlanta or to Tennessee or to wherever the fuck. So he was always dealing. He was always at the NWA meetings. So he was always dealing with the other promoters. It wasn't hard to get talent. And when his business was up, it wasn't hard to keep him. The thing that I look at on the old Detroit shows during that promotional war time is the fact that he started having 12 and 13 matches. You've seen those old body press programs.
I have them, yeah.
A dozen matches and name after name after name of NWA stars and top guys from different territories. I don't know what the payoffs were like, except the guys at the top, that Sheik took care of made out okay. But when you got 40 guys on a card, even if you sell 12,000 tickets, that's diluting the payroll. And we know from Brian Solomon, who did the book on the Sheik that'll be out early this year, that I think it was 1973. It was 1 year in the early 70s. The Sheik declared $400,000 worth of personal income. That's what he declared on his taxes. We've mentioned the cash aspect of wrestling promotion and et cetera. $400,000 in 1973. What's that? About $1.5 million these days. But I don't know if this territory pertains to our exercise. I don't know if it would have been conducive to the Midnight Express or myself.
Well, again, those are two different things because it was a territory with a lot of managers, although the managers were typically with the Sheik.
Yes. And see that, and you know, and boy, howdy, I would have loved that, except for the heat, to manage the Sheik at some point. That would have been cool. But again, most of the time, and you know, they did have managers. I remember George Cannon was there with the Kangaroos, and it said they would use managers, and they had tag teams. But the crew, I'm trying to figure out a way to verbally describe this. How would I describe it any other way? Possibly sign language. But to verbally describe it, it was the Sheik's style of wrestler that he primarily wanted to book. He wanted to book the Wild Men, the Abdullah the Butchers, the Pampiro Firpos, or he'd make one, JB Psycho, or Killer Brooks. The tag teams were a little bit more scientific. The Love Brothers, the Kangaroos, Ben Justice and Guy Mitchell. But there was it wasn't a territory that was high on athleticism and hard-hitting work and hot finishes that made you want to come back and see returns, except for the Sheiks. The style was more rooted in the 50s, where, you know, Sheik got over and learned his shit. And so as a promoter, you tend to always present that style of wrestling. So if the 1975 big time wrestling with the Sheik was still around in 1985, and you dropped the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express in the middle of it, it would look like, you know, here was Wild Bull Curry and the fucking Sheik, and all of a sudden Tiger Mask and Dynamite Kid broke out. It was a completely different style. We fit in the Carolinas because of the tradition of athletic, good workers there for many, many years. I'm not saying the people in Detroit weren't good workers or even great athletes, but it was a different style, and it was more the punch and kick, and it was less high spots. And I know people now are going, well, Cornette hates high spots. No, I love high spots. I hate gymnastics. So it was a little bit, it was a different style that maybe the Midnight might not have translated too well. If I got a monster like the Sheik liked, well, I can manage monsters. So I might have worked there. But since they were out of business in 1985, we didn't have to work. But I would have liked to have worked for the Sheik and worked that territory in the early 70s when it was up and you could make money if the opportunity had presented itself. So that's one I don't know if I would have actually, if I had any other choices, I would have loved Indiana just because it's close to home, but I don't think I would have worked there for business reasons. The Sheik's territory, I probably would have. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I'm trying to visualize you in that territory. I can visualize you. I can't really visualize Dennis. I can visualize Bobby there more than I can Dennis.
You can visualize Bobby anywhere.
That's true.
I can't visualize Stan at either, because as soon as Yukon Moose Cholak said, I'll hit you with a splash, or fucking Bobo Brazil said, I'll give you the Coco Clop in the corner, he's like, fuck. Because that's one thing. Again, the Sheik did stay with the same names for quite some time. You could see the same main event matchup in the Sheik's territory in 1977 as you saw in 1967, and even though it wasn't the Sheiks, they were probably wrestling in 1957. Let's talk about St. Louis real quick, because obviously that wasn't a territory. You didn't get booked into the St. Louis territory. You got invited to come to St. Louis to appear on the event, is the best way to say it. St. Louis stood on its own. And we've talked about it so much and read the programs and everything over the shows. I know a lot of our listeners have the history. But basically, Sam Muchnick had started promoting St. Louis in 1945 before the advent of television, before the formation of the modern territories as they existed. There were still booking offices. There was a booking office in Nashville that supplied talent to all sorts of local promoters around its area. And there was a booking office in Amarillo, and there's a booking office in where this place and that place. But since there was no television, the parameters of the territories and how they were determined was based on guys not only running towns, but getting television coverage in a specific region and pretty much making it like a fort, where in that region, the people primarily knew your wrestlers and your programs and your shows and nobody else's. That didn't exist in the 40s per se, but Muchnick would bring in the very top wrestlers in the business to main event, to challenge for the title or to be in the main event matches. And obviously when he was able to reconcile with Lou Thez, and Thez dropped his and his father's promotion. Well, they didn't drop it, but they kind of started working behind the scenes, and eventually it became one. Muchnick would bring guys from the Kansas and Missouri area to fill out the cards, because Orville Brown, who was originally going to be the first NWA champion after it was formed until he was in a car wreck and lost his sight, that's why they picked Thez. Orville Brown was a big mover and shaker in the wrestling business as one of the top wrestlers in the world. And also he was from Kansas, promoting in that area. That's how the Kansas part of the equation in the Central States became inextricably locked with St. Louis, because of not only their proximity next door to each other, but also because Orville Brown had been a bigger name in the 40s in wrestling than Sam Muchnick was. And then when Muchnick and Thez got together and Muchnick got Buddy Rogers to come to work for him and established himself as the dominant promoter in St. Louis, it was a place where they brought the best in and built the big matches. And the world title was most important. And the main event stars were main event guys that you heard about in the magazines or in the newspapers. And then the opening matches would be guys from the local area. And so you only got a chance to work for Sam Muchnick if you came to St. Louis and worked on a show in St. Louis. He didn't run spot shows. He didn't run any other markets. So if you were a top guy in another territory, but you got the attention of Sam Muchnick in some fashion, or you were a top guy and they were wanting to prep you for the NWA championship or just to be a bigger guy, you would get booked into St. Louis, and that's how you knew you'd made it, and that's how you knew you were getting a build. They brought Flair there. They brought DiBiase there. They brought everybody that was going to be somebody in the NWA came to St. Louis. The payoffs for the main event were off the fucking charts. We've documented them and we've talked about them. You could make up to $6,000 for an NWA title match in St. Louis in the big building, the Checker Dome, the arena, and several thousand in the Keel on sellouts. But the opening match guys might get $187.50 because Sam Muchnick paid like the promoters before the TV days, and the main event drew the house and got almost all the money. It would have been a privilege to be asked to come to work for Sam Muchnick in St. Louis, and me and the Midnight Express would have done it in a heartbeat. I'm not sure he would have asked us, because I think, was Bobby Heenan the only manager that he ever used, or did he break down over the last couple of years and use anybody else?
I'm trying to remember who he would have used after Heenan with Lanza.
Point is, Sam Muchnick did not use managers. He felt they were a distraction. And tag team matches usually didn't main event St. Louis unless it was combinations of former world champions like Jack Briscoe and Terry Funk teaming up against Harley Race and Gene Kiniski, or whatever the case. So it would have been a privilege and an honor, but I don't know that we would have worked there. I mean, you might have been on the card, but I don't think we would have gotten a multi-month or year push and he didn't, did he even have a tag team title? They just used the Central States tag title after a while, didn't they?
I think so.
So, so that was one of those deals where, I would have loved to have worked for Sam Muchnick any time just to say that I did it and a chance to be part of that history, but I don't think we fit.
I agree. Wasn't a tag team town, wasn't a manager town.
We could have gone in and worked the third match, but...
Well, here's the other... I mean, that's the other catch. You guys could have come in and worked the third match, and more than likely, they would have recognized a reaction you probably would have gotten for working your style of match. And that may have changed things. You never know.
It might have, now that you mention it. Since we're just whatabouting, what about that? But by the time, I've never been so disappointed. Because we did actually get to work St. Louis, and we did get to work the Kiel Auditorium in 1985. But that was 3 years after Sam had retired. And I've told this story. We went there in the house in the Kiel Auditorium back when tickets were probably $8 and $10, $12,000. There wasn't even 1,500 people in the Kiel Auditorium. It was like going to a funeral. That historic old building, that giant curtain on that stage. You could smell the history, and you could see Buddy Rogers standing there under those old lights or whatever, and it was just 1,200 or 1,300 dreary fucking people watching a lackluster card. And it hurt my heart. But we made it. We just made it 3 years too late. And so other than that, I mean, they probably, if Sam had still been around when we got with the rock and roll on Crockett's TV, they might have brought us in and had that match, and that would have been lovely, and I'm sure it would have tore the house down. But in the glory days, Sam Muchnick really didn't need much of anybody. So we needed to be on his card more than he needed us on his card. But yeah, so if we're keeping track, wouldn't have worked Indianapolis, would have worked Detroit for the money, the trips, and the business, but not sure how we would have fit in. Would have loved to work for Sam Muchnick, but it wouldn't have been a full-time job. I got to go next to San Francisco. If there was anything going on at that point in time with Roy Shire, I would have loved to have been a part of it.
You know what?
Of course, there wasn't.
In theory, I mean, Bill Watts ended up liking Roy Shire and learning a lot from him, maybe learning how to yell at people from him.
Yeah, I swear to God, it sounds exactly like that's where he learned it from.
But I don't know if you would have liked that.
Book.
You like Bill Watts, you had no problem with that, but Roy Shire... Bill Watts had a lot of detractors, but there were people who recognized... Well, I mean, people recognized Roy Shire's genius, but people didn't like him the way some people like Bill Watts.
Well, I wasn't going to fucking take him out to the movies on a date. If the San Francisco territory, as it had been in the glory days, was still operating, and Roy Shire got Ray Stevens over as the hottest box office attraction in the business. Roy Shire put together and mentored Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson as the greatest tag team in the business because Roy Shire had been Ray Stevens' brother in the 50s, the Shire brothers.
Yeah, in fact, he thought he was going to get a piece of the territory, too.
Yes, and Ray Stevens told me that. He said they had a law in California, if you were a promoter, you couldn't be a wrestler, but he was supposed to get a piece of the territory after it got going under the table from his ex-brother. And that never happened. But here's Roy Shire here's somebody who Bill Watts acknowledges learning booking from. Here's somebody that was a booker for the hottest wrestling city in the country in San Francisco and drawing those sellouts at the Cow Palace and the revolutionary tag teams of Stevens and Patterson, and the logic that Roy Shire put into everything, and the way that he made people believe. From reading Rock Rims's books, from working for Bill Watts, from knowing other people involved and the influences, you can see that's where Watts got it from. You've heard the stories of the Heat and the Cow Palace, where Afa and Sika, the Samoans, they had to smarten them up and break them into the business because they were jumping the heels and kicking the shit out of them at the Cow Palace. They had heat, which is, I think, where Watts got it from, because Shire knew how to make everything mean something. And also, San Francisco had great workers and great talent. The Midnight Express would have, if Patterson and Stevens fit in, the Midnight Express would have fit in. San Francisco, it's a short trip territory, Northern California plus San Francisco, compared to like Los Angeles, is like trading your 5,000 square foot mansion for a tent. I've always hated Los Angeles and Southern California. It's so flat, so dry, the traffic, bleh. Northern California's got those beaches and those mountains and the Haight-Ashbury and the cool places, right? Summer of love. I could have lived there, and I would have loved to work for Roy Shire just to learn from him. And I mean, you know, I liked Bill Watts, but it's not like Bill Watts was the friendliest person in the world, but I was learning from a college professor. And also, back in the day, you could make money in San Francisco because of San Francisco. You might not make a lot of money in San Bernardino or Sacramento or whatever, but especially for the main event guys, the Cow Palace payoffs. Stevens also told me he made between 100 and 150 grand in a year in 1962, 63, when they had their first hot stretch. What would that be today? 600 grand? So you could make money, short trip territory, great place to live back then in the 60s and 70s if you could stay away from the Manson family. And you get to learn booking from Roy Shire. I would have done that. I would have done that in a heartbeat. You wouldn't have done that?
Depends on when. It depends on when. Possibly. I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't have been a good wrestler because I wouldn't have put up with someone like Roy Shire. I would have had a lot of problems pretty quickly.
Ah, come on.
But
just because he spit his tobacco juice on the floor of the TV station?
Just because I haven't heard anyone say anything good about him.
Yeah, no, pretty much everybody hated him.
Everyone hated him except Bill Watts, which is funny.
Well, and then again, Watts never said he wanted to fucking, marry the guy, but he learned. He learned. And he was obviously a pretty good teacher and a pretty good student because it was replicated. But I would have picked, and that's where we're going next, Los Angeles. I would have picked San Francisco over Los Angeles because, as I mentioned, that part of the country, every time I went to Los Angeles for Crockett or for Vince, I just was like, what the fuck? And by the same token, if you, as we both have read Rock Rims's books, the approach to the business was completely different in Southern California than Northern California. And the booking was almost pretty much just on the fly. And a lot of times, and rightfully so, LaBelle would let his top guys call most everything. And Freddie Blassie was over like God and was in on everything, as he should have been, because he drew the majority of the money. But, it was a different type of territory. And I've talked to people who worked there in the dying days. Tom Pritchard got a chance to work there like the year before they went under. And Kenny Wayne had been out there, and Adrian Street. And Tom said he liked it because it was, he's like 20 years old and, living in Los Angeles and a lot of girls, I guess, and, whatever, even though there was no money, he just got into business. So he was just glad to be in the business. There was money there for the main event guys when the territory was up. But by this point, it was down and on the way out. I don't know. It was a short trip territory, but at the same time, when you're in Los Angeles, it takes 2 hours to go across the street. Now it does. 40 years ago, I don't know. But high living expenses all the way out on the West Coast in California, that far away from my home. Nobody that I'm really anxious to learn from, like a Roy Shire or a Dory Funk Sr. or an Eddie Graham or a whatever. And the style was, again, what it was tailored to the Chic and Fred Blassie and John Tolos and people with snakes around their necks and etc., or the lucha influence. I don't know if the Midnight would have, maybe we could have had some real rip snorters with Gordman and Goliath. But between the two California territories, I believe I would have picked San Francisco for the reasons that I mentioned.
I don't think you would have fit into Los Angeles too well after they lost their English-speaking television. You would have been perfect before them.
But no, then I could have got Alex to come out and say what Jim Cornette is trying to say is okay.
Corny says
that
Dick Lane better watch out next Friday night.
And then see also that, Dick Lane, they had the recognized announcer. The most recognized announcer in wrestling was Dick Lane in the early 70s, but not because of wrestling. It's because of roller derby. Because all of the wrestling shows were still regionally syndicated. They were only in their territories. But since Dick Lane did the roller derby or the roller games and the LA T-Birds, which were nationally syndicated, LA had the only nationally syndicated wrestling announcer in the business at that time, but he just wasn't doing wrestling when he was nationally syndicated. However, I got to go to Amarillo next because, again, Dory Funk Sr., and maybe even not in 1985, I don't even know that I knew what kind of impact that Dory Funk Sr. had on the modern era of professional wrestling since the last 50 years of the 20th century and the first 20 of this one. How many people he trained, how many people he broke in, how many things that he started and got going, how many relationships he had with the other major promoters and bookers in the business. And all from this little podunk town in West Texas. And Amarillo used to be a territory in those days that was so geographically isolated from everything else and so cut off and got no outside the territory news coverage that if somebody in Florida or Georgia or the Carolinas or California or wherever was doing an angle where they got their leg broken and they were going to be out for 3 months, they'd go to Amarillo, nobody'd find them. But at that same point, they were another territory that I said they did good business in small markets, consistent business for years and years and years. And to have the old man there who had a deciding vote at the NWA meetings on who became champion, who was personal friends with every major figure in the business and could put a word in for you and make your career. And, they loved wild Tennessee type wrestling down there in West Texas, the blood and the guts and the violence and the wildness. I probably would have been knifed or strung up within 6 weeks. I think, if they liked the Funk Brothers as a team, they'd probably like the Midnight Express. It wasn't a money territory, and it certainly wasn't a place that you went because you just were dying to live in Amarillo, Texas for some reason. And even then, a lot of the people in the territory that got over, like Ricky Romero, he was from there, and the father of the Youngbloods, a lot of the locals would stay there and get over and not have to go anywhere else. But to work for Dory Funk Sr., if he had still been around, if the territory had still been around, I would think you weren't going to make any money, but you'd learn some stuff. That's a place that you went when you didn't have a better option, but you wanted to be at least doing something positive. Well, I'll learn, I'll get experience, I'll get contacts, get the old man to put a word in for me at the NWA convention, whatever the case. It's not somewhere you went out of a sense of, wow, I'm going to make a ton of money and I'm going to enjoy the fuck out of living in Amarillo, Texas. But it's like you're going to fucking mathematics school with Einstein. What do you think, Brian?
I think you would have not liked the money in Amarillo. And if it was 1985, you would have hated it. But if it was in the mid-70s, you would have had a good time.
Yes. And that's why this is all whataboutism, because so basically, out of the 3 defunct areas, I wouldn't have wanted to work Indianapolis. I probably would have worked Detroit. I wouldn't want to work L.A., but I probably would have worked San Francisco. I would have died to work St. Louis, and I would have loved to work underneath Dory Funk Sr. That's where we're at so far. So now, in coming installments, we're going to talk about the places we actually could have gone and what the money was like and what the talent was like and what the living conditions and travel conditions were like in 1985. So we don't have to make up anything else because these places were all actually still running and still operating. So, again, to reiterate the choices, and we're going to be covering these. Obviously, we've just talked for fucking half an hour, 45 minutes on the places that were defunct and whether I would have wanted to work there. So going through these, we're going to go into a little bit more detail, and we'll do a few apiece on various programs until we get them all in. And then, boy, for 2022 holiday season, this will be a great omnibus. But so far left, we've got Florida, Georgia, Continental, Memphis, the Carolinas, Mid-South, Dallas, San Antonio, the AWA, Kansas City, Portland, the WWF, Montreal, Puerto Rico, poor old Savoldi's ICW, and maybe Calgary, depending on whether Bruce was running a spot show that month or not. That's what we got left. Which one are you most excited to talk about, Brian?
I don't know if excitement's the word.
Excitement is in the air.
It's interesting. I mean, in my head, I can kind of figure out what's what. I think it'll be interesting to hear what you think about going to the WWF a year and a half earlier than you talked to Vince. That could be kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the interesting places to work were kind of done by that point in time. So when we're talking about, the Midnight Express going to Florida, I mean, it's an interesting conversation, but knowing the realities of how things worked out, thank God you didn't go there.
Well,
so it's a weird exercise because we're talking about all these what ifs, but thank God every one of these. Yeah.
There would have been a chance because what didn't happen until late January 1985, Eddie Graham's suicide.
Right.
If they had asked us in December 1984, you want to go to Florida and work for Eddie Graham? Yes, please.
See, that's where it gets interesting. There's where you get an interesting little wrinkle. What if you guys had gone there instead of the Freebirds?
Yeah.
But again, I don't want to do this now. We're going to do this on a future installment, you said.
Yes. And I have a feeling if a lot of these installments will come over the next few weeks. So we have some fun stuff to talk about over the holidays. But I'll tell you what. If we'd have gone to Florida to work for Eddie Graham and ended up working for Mike Graham, talk about the ultimate bait and switch there. I love you, Mike. I'm kidding. But anyway.
He's not listening.
I know that. And he wouldn't have been even if he was still alive. I just thought I'd shout that out to him from wherever he was. But anyway, yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about, and among other things, over the next few weeks is an examination of these territories in 1985 and what it was like and what the positives and negatives were of working in those various places. Otherwise than that, we've completed our Turkey Day edition of the Jim Cornette Experience. Gobble, gobble. Aren't you happy?
Delighted. Just delighted, and I'm even more excited about the drive-thru coming up in a few days, filled with listener questions.